Hey, what's going on? Jeff Ratcliffe here. Defense matters in football. You know it, I know it. Hey, anybody who's watched football knows it. But often for fantasy purposes, we overlook this fact when it comes to our running backs. The defenses that our running backs face matters. In today's NFL, we know a lot of defenses are rolling out sub-package very often. So how often are running backs facing the sub-package defense? How often are they facing the base defense? And really simply here, if they're facing sub-package more often, that means there's extra defensive backs on the field. You know, in a nickel defense, you have an extra defensive back. In a dime defense, you have two extra defensive backs on the field, and that gives the running back an advantage. This is important information here, and it's most definitely a fantasy secret weapon. And you know, when we look at some of the ball carriers last year, the guys who led the league, the top 10 in rushing attempts, let's get those guys on the screen and take a look at how these numbers break down, because you're going to see, you know, very interestingly, right at the top there, Saquon Barkley and David Johnson were facing sub-package defense the least out of this group last year. Just 56% for Saquon and 59% for David Johnson. Now, Saquon is a freak of nature, and we know that, and he's very likely going to be one of the top, if not the top player taken in your drafts. But David Johnson's up there as well. Now let's flash back to last year, and let's really focus in on David Johnson, because last year he was likely taken either second or third in most drafts in 12-team leagues, 10-team leagues, whatever it was, in PPR. He was the second or third player taken overall, and he didn't fare that poorly. I think ultimately he was number 9 on the season, number 11 in points per game at the running back position. But that was still a big-time disappointment for a lot of folks for fantasy purposes. I think this number right here gives us a lot of insight, because he was really put at a major disadvantage when you compare him to some of these other guys. And like, look at Todd Gurley. Now, we'll talk more about Gurley in a minute, but Gurley almost exclusively faced sub-package defense. So he had an advantage on almost every single one of his rushing attempts. Whereas David Johnson, I mean, you're talking, you know, 4 times out of 10, he's going up against base defense. That puts him at a bigger disadvantage. Now, I do expect that number to change this year under Cliff Kingsbury. With that offense that he's going to implement, I do expect to see defenses primarily in sub-package. So that should help David Johnson's efficiency out. But last year, if you wanted an explanation for why his numbers were down, this is a good one right here. So let's talk about Todd Gurley. There is a huge difference between Todd Gurley in 2016 in Jeff Fisher's offense and then Todd Gurley for, what, a season and 3 quarters under Sean McVay. I know, week 16 still hurts. Watching C.J. Anderson rumbling for all those yards and the touchdown when it should have been Gurley in your fantasy championship. I know. We're going to get over it, I swear. Time and therapy, we'll get over it. But comparing Todd Gurley under Jeff Fisher to Todd Gurley under Sean McVay, he's the same player. Let's be clear about that. It's not like Todd Gurley all of a sudden remembered how to play football in 2017. The difference between the stat lines that we saw under Jeff Fisher and the stat lines that we're seeing under Sean McVay is the fact that Gurley under Fisher faced a whole heck of a lot of base defense, and now under Sean McVay almost doesn't see any base defense whatsoever. That extra defensive back or 2 on the field, I'm telling you, do not underestimate the impact here. It is very significant for these running backs, and Todd Gurley is the ultimate case study. But in the same right, you see Jordan Howard on this list, 82% last season. So he was one of the highest there on the list. In the league, he was one of the highest as a whole, not just the guys who made this list. And yet, despite having this advantage on 8 out of 10 rushes, over 8 out of 10 rushes, he only averaged 3.7 yards per carry. That efficiency there is, well, lack of efficiency is concerning. And I know Jordan Howard is still a guy for fantasy purposes that a lot of people are looking to as maybe a bounce back candidate. I mean, he's with the Eagles now, but keep in mind, the Eagles offense, that's going to be basically almost the same as what he ran in the Bears offense. So look for him as a short yardage guy. But honestly, Jordan Howard as a viable, even RB3, I think might be questionable. Miles Sanders is the guy who I'm looking at there in Philadelphia this year. Another interesting number on this list, 76% for Joe Mixon. So it was one of the higher numbers. But I tell you what, we could see this number increase this year. Zach Taylor now in a head coach. We know Zach Taylor, well, he worked with Sean McVay. So if he comes in and brings that 11 personnel that we see in the Sean McVay offense, so 3 wide receivers, that puts a defense in a position where they're going to have to run out sub-packages pretty much all the time, that means, you know, Mixon could have a big-time advantage. So definitely the breakout potential. I mean, he was a top 10 guy last year, but I mean, elite potential with Mixon breaking into that elite tier is very real, especially if he faces a ton of sub-package defense this year. Some names who aren't on the list. I think Damian Williams is really fascinating. He is a hot fantasy name. You're going to see him go in the second round in a 12-team PPR, might even crack the first round. He's gaining momentum as we head into August here in the fantasy draft season. But last year he had 50 carries. And you know what? All 50 carries came against sub-package defense. This is important information. We need to know this stuff for fantasy purposes because he was at an advantage. Now, that's not to say that he's not going to face a lot of sub-package defense this year, because he will. In that offense, we know it's high-powered. It puts defenses, you know, at a disadvantage just how high-powered it is. Most defenses, that is. So they're going to be out there in a sub-package, so he's going to have that advantage. But I don't expect 100% of the time. So I do expect his efficiency to regress somewhat. I'm being a little cautious with Damian Williams. I have him in the third round, not in the second round where he's currently going. So I don't know if I would risk Damian Williams. He could be one of those guys who certainly blows up this year, but he could also be one of those guys who disappoints in a big-time way. Another number to get to cover here that didn't make the list, but he was just off the list here. Nick Chubb last year, we know, hey, he was a revelation for the Browns, and he faced sub-package defense just 47% of the time. So he was doing that at a disadvantage. That really says something about Chubb's season. And with Odell Beckham Jr. in that offense, I expect them to actually see more sub-package defense. So Chubb's numbers could be better this year from an efficiency standpoint. The one challenge, of course, with Chubb is the fact that Kareem Hunt looms on that depth chart when he returns from suspension. We'll be well in the thick of the fantasy season. It'll be week 10. So, you know, that if you had Chubb as a potential, you know, top 10, top 5 even fantasy RB at that point, those numbers may decline, and it's the wrong time with the fantasy playoffs coming up just a month after Kareem Hunt gets back on the field. So something to think about there, but I expect Chubb, I mean, it already showed he was super effective, essentially at a disadvantage last year. If they move that number up, if he faces sub-package defense more like, you know, 65% of the time, somewhere around there, which is about average for these running backs, then I think his numbers, believe it or not, could be even better for Chubb this year. So something to think about with him. Another real quick one for you here. I think this Broncos backfield is really interesting. I know, hey, Phillip Lindsey, after the breakout year, a lot of people like this guy, no doubt about it. Royce Freeman, disappointing year, right? He was drafted widely in the third round, disappointed for fantasy purposes. Now, last year, Phillip Lindsey faced sub-package defense 65% of his carries. Royce Freeman, 52%. So when you look at the efficiency, the difference between the two, that is a big one right there. And I tell you, if you go and watch our yards after contact per attempt video, which I highly recommend, you're going to hear me say that Freeman was actually much more effective after contact than Lindsey. 3.2 yards after contact per attempt. Phillip Lindsey just 2.3. So, you know, these differences really paint an interesting picture in this backfield. I don't think we can undersell Royce Freeman just yet. I think you got to look at him as an intriguing guy to get in the middle rounds of your drafts. After Lindsey's off the board, and he could very well pass Lindsey this year in terms of fantasy value. That wouldn't surprise me. I still have Lindsey ahead of him, but it would not surprise me. That's definitely a potential outcome in 2019 fantasy football. Hey, if you want to get this information, there is one place to get it. That, of course, is PFF.com. In my fantasy playbook, it's updated straight on through the fantasy draft season. We'll have the most updated information possible for your fantasy drafts. You can't get that on the newsstands. You can only get it at PFF.com.